How has the most connected society in history also become the loneliest? It's easy to forget how far we've come. In just a matter of years, we've gone from phone calls to text messages to video chat. In an instant, we can ring up a family member across the world and feel more connected with them, given the distance, than we could have at any other point in history. This was science fiction in the 20th century. It's during that same period of innovation that brought us one-click shopping, anything we could need delivered to our door the same day. And so we bought and stored and used and replaced. A generation living better than Louis XIV, yet finding ourselves more secluded than ever. Why do people, even after they have their basic needs met, with all the tools we have available, why are we not only unhappy, but largely depressed? Author and journalist Johann Hari set out across the world to speak with leading experts on depression, anxiety, and loneliness to discover both how we've gotten to this place and, more importantly, how do we as individuals and a society start to turn the tide. This is my 20-minute interview with Johann about what he learned from that research. All right, so why don't we start out with a little bit of an intro about yourself and about your work.
I wrote my book Lost Connections because there were these two mysteries that were really hanging over me for years. I think I was quite afraid to look into them in some ways. The first mystery is I'm 40 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased here in the United States, in Britain, and across the Western world, right? And I kept asking myself, why? Why is this happening? Why are so many more of us each year that passes finding it hard to get through the day, right? And I guess I wanted to understand that because of a more personal mystery. When I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me. That's how I put it at the time. And I felt very ashamed of it. I felt confused by it. I didn't understand why it was happening. And my doctor told me a story that I now realise from speaking to the leading scientists in the world on this was oversimplified, right? My doctor said, we know why people feel like this. It's just because of a problem in your brain. There's a chemical called serotonin that makes people feel good. Some people are naturally lacking it. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you some drugs. You're going to feel better. So I started taking a chemical antidepressant called Paxil, and I felt significantly better for a few months. And then this feeling of pain came back. So I went back. The doctor said, well, I didn't give you a high enough dose. I was given a high dose. Again, I felt better. Again, the feeling of pain came back. And I was really in this cycle of taking higher and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum dose you're allowed to take, at the end of which I was still really depressed. And I was surrounded by people who were becoming more and more depressed. So I just forced myself really to start looking into this. So I ended up going on this big journey for the book. I travelled over 40,000 miles. I wanted to meet the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them, most importantly. So I met, not just leading experts, but just a crazy mixture of people with different perspectives, from an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression, to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psychedelics to see if that would help. And I learned a huge number of things, but the core of what I learned is that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are in fact biological. My doctor wasn't wrong. Your genes can make you more vulnerable to these problems, just like some people find it easier to put on weight than others. And there are real changes in your brain that begin when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are not in our biology. Most of the factors for which there's scientific evidence are factors in the way we're living. And what I learned in the process of writing the book and speaking to so many scientists is, once you understand the causes of depression and anxiety in this more complex way, it opens up a much broader range of possible solutions that I saw being put into practice all over the world. And these are solutions that we need to be explaining to people and offering to them alongside, not instead of, but as an option alongside chemical antidepressants.
Why is society at large reacting in this way? What do you think are some of the influences on people's well-being that's leading to the higher and higher rates of depression and anxiety?
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the 9 causes that I wrote about in Lost Connections. We are the loneliest society there's ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer is none. Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well say nobody, right? I spent a lot of time talking to an amazing man called Professor John Cassiopo, who was the leading expert in the world on loneliness. He was at the University of Chicago. And he explained to me, why are we alive? You and me and everyone watching this. Why do we exist? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They weren't faster than the animals they took down, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And if you think about the circumstances where we evolved, if you were cut off from the tribe, you were depressed and anxious for really good reasons. You were in terrible danger. You were about to die. Those are still the impulses we have. We are the first humans ever in the long 2 million year history of our species to try to disband our tribes. And it is making us feel awful. So a key thing for me was not just to understand these problems, but okay, how do we solve those problems, right? And one of the heroes of my book Lost Connections is an amazing man called Dr. Sam Everington, who pioneered a whole different approach based on this understanding. So Sam was a general practitioner in East London, a poor part of East London where I lived for a long time. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he thinks there's some role for chemical antidepressants, but he could also see most of the people he was giving them to did become depressed again. And he could see that they were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons, right? Like, to give one of the examples I talk about in the book, loneliness. So he decided to pioneer a different approach. One day a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away in her home with dreadful depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to suggest something else. There was an area behind the suite of doctors' offices that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like, just kind of scrubland. Sam said to Lisa, what I'd like you to come and do is turn out a few times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been pretty anxious. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. We're going to find something to do together as a group, right? The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But the group starts talking, they're like, what can we do? These are inner city East London people, they don't know anything about gardening. They decided they were going to teach themselves gardening, right? Going to turn Dog Shit Alley into a beautiful garden. So they start to watch YouTube, they start to read books, they start to get their fingers in the soil. They start to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. They start to do something even more important. They started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one person didn't turn up, they'd go and look for them. They'd see if they were okay. They did what human beings do when we're part of tribes. They started to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program, found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason, right? It was dealing with some of the reasons why they felt so bad in the first place. And this is something I saw all over the world, from Sydney to Sao Paulo to San Francisco. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we're in such distress in the first place.
You said that we're living in the loneliest society there's ever been. How can that possibly be with all of these tools at our fingertips, right? We have social media, we have the ability to connect and interact with anybody in an instant. I can FaceTime my mom in a second, and if she picks up, then I can see her face to face. Has social media played some part in the fact that we are lonely?
This is a complex question with a complex answer. So the glib answer is to go, yeah, social media did this to us. It's just too simplistic. To understand this, I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the world. It's just outside Spokane in Washington State. It's called Restart Washington. I remember I arrived there. It's a clearing in the woods. I got out the car, and absolutely instinctively, I looked at my phone to check my email and felt really pissed off that I couldn't see it because there was no reception. I was like, oh wait, you came to the right place, right? And I spent a fair bit of time there. And it was totally fascinating. They get a whole range of people at Restart Washington, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed with these multiplayer role-player games like World of Warcraft, or not at the time that I was there, but now Fortnite, right? And I remember Dr. Hilary Cash, the amazing woman who runs this centre, saying to me, look, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games? Because they're getting something, right? I think what they're getting is a kind of hollow version of the things they used to get from the society, but they no longer get. They get a sense of a tribe. They get a sense of status and that they can gain in status. They get a sense they're good at something. They get a sense they're moving around. Young people barely leave their homes now. It's incredible, the figures for how rarely children play outdoors. But what they're getting is, I started to think that the relationship between, say, these games or social media and social life is like the relationship between porn and sex, right? I'm not against porn. It'll meet a certain basic itch. But if your entire sex life consisted of looking at porn, you'd be going around pissed off and irritated the whole time, because we didn't evolve to masturbate over screens, we evolved to have sex, right? That wouldn't meet your deeper needs. In the same way, I'm obviously not against the internet, it'd be ridiculous, right? But we didn't evolve to talk through screens, right? We didn't evolve to look at each other and interact with our friends through screens. If you and I were speaking even via Skype now, I wouldn't feel you were seeing me and you wouldn't feel you was the other way around, in the way that we feel that we are seeing and hearing each other now, right? Human beings have a need to be seen. The leading expert on loneliness in the world, Professor John Cacioppo, gave me a good little rule of thumb. He said, if social media is a way station for meeting people offline or staying in touch with them that you'll see offline, it's a good thing. If it's the last stop on the line, generally something's gone wrong. But I think we have to think about as well the moment in human history when social media arrives, right? A lot of the causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in my book, Lost Connections, were already supercharged by then, by the late 90s, the early 2000s. Loneliness had gone up, junk values had gone up, a whole range of things. And what happens is the internet arrives and it looks a lot like the things we've lost. You've lost friends? Here's a load of Facebook friends. You've lost status? Make some status updates, right? But it's not the thing we've lost. It's a kind of parody of the thing we've lost. And what we need to do in very practical ways is restore the thing we've lost.
It seems like today we have a lot of distractions that could potentially pull us away from that connection. It seems like a lot of people are driven through consumerism and materialism, and many of us are safer and have more than we ever have before. The size of homes has increased steadily since the 1930s and 40s. Is there any correlation between material wealth and happiness?
One of the things I found most challenging in the research for the book, because I could see how much it had played out in my own life, was some research by an amazing man called Professor Tim Kasser. So everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? As you can tell from my chins, I'm not immune to this myself. But there's equally strong evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. Professor Kasser showed, so for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? It's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that is the gist of what he said, right? But no one had scientifically investigated this until Professor Kasser. And he showed a few, I think, really important things. Firstly, he showed the more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by a really quite significant amount. I think this is because, I'm going a little bit beyond Professor Kasser here, but I think this is because everyone knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And our culture is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. If you think, partly because there's many factors going on, but partly because if you think life is about money and displaying that money, that is going to divert you from the things you actually do need to have a meaningful and satisfying life. But Professor Kasser also showed something else. So he showed the more you follow these junk values, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious. He also showed, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by these junk values. It's a cliche to say to your viewers, you won't lie on your deathbed and think about all the likes you got on Instagram and all the shoes you bought, right? You'll think about moments of love and meaning and connection in your lives. But as Professor Kasser puts it, we live in a machine that's designed to get us to neglect what is important about life, right? More 18-month-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. We're immersed in a machinery that tells us how to do this. And Professor Kasser did really interesting research about how we undo some of that. And some of it was really simple. He got a group of people to meet once every couple of weeks for 4 months and just talk about, firstly, consumer objects they thought they had to have, things like Nike sneakers. Once they talked out loud, well, how do you think your life will be different when you've got them? It didn't take long for people to start saying, oh, maybe this is bullshit that's been implanted in my head by advertising. But then the more important bit was they got people to talk about, well, what are moments, that's not a moment that's going to make you feel satisfied. What are moments you have actually felt your life was meaningful, satisfying? We'll talk about different things. For some people it was playing music, for some people it was swimming, for some people it was writing, whatever it was. And they started to say, well, how could you build more of that into your life, seeking more of that and doing more of that, and less of seeking this kind of junk values stuff. And just that process of meeting every couple of weeks and checking in with each other and explaining how they tried to do it led to a measurable, they did a good scientific study of this, a measurable shift in people's values to become less materialistic, which we know relates to less depression and anxiety. Now, of course, it's the case that, and a guy called Professor Richard Layard has done research on this, if you don't have a baseline of material goods, right, if you are in poverty, then you are going to be unhappy. But once you've actually reached a fairly low level of income that you're not actually wanting for basic things, additional money makes you no happier, and actually constantly seeking it leads to a corruption of values that makes you significantly more unhappy.
We talked a little bit before we sat down here about Marie Kondo and minimalism and this movement of people rejecting consumerism and materialism to live with less stuff, to purchase less things, to focus less on status in their lives. Do you think, I'm curious just what your thoughts on this movement towards less is, and if you think in some way it will help people figure out their values again and reset these junk values that we've created for ourselves.
I haven't looked into it in a huge amount of detail, but we live in a hurricane of messages telling us the answer to our pain and distress lies in shopping, right? There's this really interesting study that was done in 1978. It's really simple. You get a bunch of 5-year-olds and you divide them into 2 groups. First group is shown 2 advertisements for whatever the equivalent to like Dora the Explorer or the Teletubbies was in 1978. I forget what it was. Second group is shown no advertisements. Then all the kids are told, hey kids, you've got a choice now. You can either play with a nice boy who doesn't have the toy in the advertisement, or you can play with a nasty boy who's got the toy. The kids who'd seen just 2 advertisements overwhelmingly chose the nasty boy who had the toy, and the kids who hadn't seen the advertisements overwhelmingly chose the nice boy who didn't have the toy, right? So just 2 ads, just 2, were enough to prime those kids to choose an inanimate lump of plastic over the possibility of fun and connection, right? Every single person watching your video has seen more than 2 ads today, right? More than 2 advertising messages. So we're living in this hurricane of messages bombarding us with a very particular... Before advertising sells any specific product, it sells the idea that the solution lies in purchasing things, right? I mean, imagine, advertising is the ultimate frenemy, right? It's saying, babe, I love you. I think you're great. If only you didn't stink. I mean, I'm just saying, if only you weren't so hairy. Just saying, right? It's the ultimate, the premise of it is it has to make you dissatisfied, right? I mean, in the if you look at what advertising people say internally to each other, they're very candid about this. They call them invented wants, right? Because actually, the things that we need are relatively limited. The whole machinery has to be built around making us feel inadequate and then making us buy the solution, right? So I think movements that say, I'm just going to purge this shit, right? That is not the answer, right? Of course, there are nice things. We all like to have nice things. I have some nice things. But the idea that this ceaseless treadmill of buying and displaying useless bullshit, the idea that we might want to step off that treadmill and go, maybe I've got a limited amount of time in which to be alive. Maybe I'll spend my time on things that are more meaningful. Seems to me to be a really positive step.
Thanks for watching this video. If you want to get the full 40-minute interview with Johan, you can get it at patreon.com/MattDiavella. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.